There are many terrifying nomads in history, but only one people were remembered with faces like monsters. When the empires of the ancient world saw their inhuman faces rising over the horizon, they believed their world was about to end. But did their world really end? Before we find out, hit the subscribe button if you are interested in historical contents like this. So, who are these people with inhuman faces, and where did they come from? The Romans called them the Huns. They came from beyond the restless waters of the Maeotic Sea, the place we now call the Sea of Azov, on the lonely northern edge of Asia. Their roots stretched deep into the great Eurasian steppe, that endless sea of grass where wind, horse, and rider became one. It was here, in the late 4th century CE, that the Huns rode into history for the first time. They lived differently from every people the Romans had known. They lived in felt-covered tents, yurts, which could be taken apart in minutes, loaded onto wagons, and carried wherever they wished. Ammianus confirmed their nomadic nature, saying that a Hun might be conceived in one place, born in another, and grow up in yet another land, so that no one could tell where he truly came from. Their lives depended on their herds. Horses, cattle, sheep, and goats gave them milk to drink, meat to eat, hides for clothing, and even trade goods. But above all, their greatest treasure was their horse. On horseback, the Hun was not a man, he was a weapon. And yet, their power was not the first thing that struck the Romans. It was their faces. The first time the Huns appeared on the horizon, they did not look like men at all. They seemed like creatures from a nightmare that had wandered into the daylight. Their faces were scarred, cut across the cheeks so deep it was as though blades had kissed them at birth. Their skin was bare, smooth, without the hair of a man's beard. It was as if they had been marked from childhood, shaped into something not quite human. They were compact, broad, thick-necked men, strong and sturdy in build. But their strangest feature was their skulls. Imagine a man whose forehead has been pressed flat since childhood, stretched so that his head jutted forward like the prow of a ship. That was the Hun. To the Roman eyes, it was a horrifying sight. But to the Huns, it was their pride and identity. It was their way of saying, "We are Huns, and we are not like you." Men saw their faces, their heads, and trembled. They looked like nightmares made flesh. But even with the terror their faces brought, their true power did not lie in their strange faces or frightening skulls. It lay in the way they fought. To face the Huns in battle was to face a new type of war. Their combat power lived first in their skill as mounted archers. They could strike from horseback with the precision of a marksman on foot. But terror was their sharpest weapon. Entire cities chose surrender rather than face them in battle, and that was how they conquered empires. Around 370 CE, the Huns made a decision that changed the history of the world. They crossed the great Don River and descended upon the Alans, a proud Sarmatian people who lived on its eastern banks. The Alans fought bravely, but they were no match for the relentless arrows and thunderous hooves of the newcomers. Jordanes, the Gothic historian, would later write how the Huns exhausted the Alans by their incessant attacks and subdued them. Those who survived were given a choice to either submit or perish. Many fled, but many more were absorbed into the Hunnic army. Now the Huns had new allies. Alan warriors, fierce horsemen, were added to their ranks. Armed with this fresh power, the Huns turned westward. They marched upon Greuthungi, the eastern branch of the Ostrogoths. lords of the Pontic steppe. The shock was devastating. Their aged king, Ermanaric, unable to face the onslaught, is said to have taken his own life around 375 CE. His successor, Vithimirus, tried desperately to rally the Gothic tribes. He even recruited a contingent of Hunnic mercenaries to fight on his side against the larger Hunnic-Alan coalition pressing into Gothic lands. This unusual move reflected the early phase of Hun expansion, when different warbands operated independently and might serve either as allies or enemies, depending on circumstance. But it was hopeless. In the chaos, Vithimirus himself was slain, and the Gothic frontier crumbled like a wall of sand. Overnight, the ancient balance of Eastern Europe collapsed. The mighty Goths, once the terror of Rome, were now broken. Some scattered north and west, seeking new homes. Others were pulled into the orbit of their conquerors, living now under Hun-appointed leaders. By 375 CE, the steppe no longer belonged to the Goths, it belonged to the Huns. And soon, they reached Rome. In 376 CE, tens of thousands of displaced Visigoths, the Thervingi, arrived at the Danube, desperate for sanctuary. Led by Fritigern and Alavivus, they begged Emperor Valens for asylum. The emperor, hoping to turn refugees into allies, allowed them into Roman lands. But what was meant as a solution became a nightmare. Corruption, famine, and mismanagement drove the Goths to rebellion. Within 2 years, Rome faced disaster. The reckoning came at Adrianople in 378 CE. There, Gothic warriors, driven from their homeland by the Hun storm, annihilated a Roman army and slew Emperor Valens himself. It was one of the greatest defeats in Rome's long history, and its roots lay in the advance of the Huns. The consequences rolled on like an avalanche. The so-called Gothic War, 378 to 382, ended with the Visigoths being granted land inside Roman borders. The empire had been forced to welcome those it could not destroy, and worse was yet to come. Around 406 CE, a bold Hun chieftain named Uldin emerged. For a time, Uldin fought beside the Romans, lending his mounted warriors to the great general Stilicho. When the Gothic leader Radagaisus invaded Italy with a massive host, it was Uldin's army that won the battle for him. Near Florence, Radagaisus was crushed, and Rome was spared yet another sack. But friendship with the Huns was as fickle as the wind. By 408 CE, Uldin turned on his Roman partners. Leading his own men across the Danube, he seized the fortress of Castramartus in Moesia and demanded tribute from Constantinople. However, his plan proved fragile. The Romans bribed his men, and one by one, they defected. Uldin's strength faded, and with it, his dreams of conquest. His rise and fall showed us that Hun leaders could be powerful, but only so long as their men believed in them. From these shifting alliances and sudden betrayals, the Huns began to change. No longer were they just scattered warbands, here today and gone tomorrow. By the 420s, they were being forged into something greater, under the rule of a man named Rugila. Rugila was no ordinary chief. He was a unifier, a leader who bound the restless clans into a steady, terrifying power. Under his hand, the Huns became more than raiders. They became a force Rome itself had to reckon with. And then, in 434 CE, Rugila died suddenly. The mantle of power was passed to his two nephews, Attila and his elder brother Bleda. The brothers Attila and Bleda ruled the Huns together, and their eyes soon turned toward the glittering cities of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was the year 441 CE, and fate handed them the perfect chance. The empire's armies were distracted, its defenses in the Balkans stretched thin. Like a storm rolling down from the north, the Huns struck from their base in Pannonia and poured across the Danube. The attack came with terrifying speed. One after another, proud Roman cities fell. Singidunum, what we know as Belgrade today, was taken and burned. Frontier towns like Margus and Viminacium were ravaged, their walls broken, their people scattered or slain. The Hun horsemen swept through the Maritsa Valley in Thrace, leaving nothing but ash behind. Even the imperial city of Sirmium could not stand. Panic gripped Constantinople. Emperor Theodosius II was forced to recall soldiers from as far away as Sicily. But even that was not enough. By the end of 442 CE, he had no choice but to accept a shaky truce with the Huns, a mere pause in a storm that had only begun. For in 443, the Huns returned, fiercer and stronger than before. This time, Attila's army brought weapons the Romans had not expected, from steppe warriors, siege engines. Great towers rolled against city walls, battering rams slammed into gates, and Roman defenses crumbled under the relentless assault. Ratiaria fell. Naissus, modern Niš, was smashed open, and its people were slaughtered without mercy. The devastation spread. Hun horsemen stormed through the Morava Valley, seizing Serdica, Sofia, Philippopolis, Plovdiv, and Arcadiopolis in quick succession. Theodosius sent his armies to stop them, but they were beaten back one by one. One imperial force was crushed outside Constantinople itself. Another was destroyed at Gallipoli. The empire's proud soldiers lay broken, and the road to the great capital was wide open. Theodosius II, humbled and desperate, begged for peace. In 443 CE, he paid dearly for it. The treaty terms were brutal. The empire had to hand over 6,000 Roman pounds of gold just to atone for failing to pay earlier debts. Worse still, their yearly tribute to the Huns was raised to 2,100 pounds of gold. The imperial treasury groaned under this impossible weight. Yet, with the gold in their saddlebags, the Huns pulled back north. It was around this time that Attila's co-ruler, his brother Bleda, died. Whether by chance or by Attila's hand, no one knows for certain. But with Bleda gone around 445 CE, Attila became sole ruler of the Huns, the undisputed Khagan. The Eastern Romans hoped for peace. Instead, in 447 CE, Attila prepared an even greater invasion. This time, he himself led the host southward, driving into Moesia and Thrace with the full might of the Hun horde. On the banks of the Utus River, which we call Iskar today, he met the Roman army under their commander Arnagisclus. The battle was fierce, a desperate clash of steel and horseflesh. The Romans fought with courage, but the Huns broke them. Arnagisclus himself was cut down, and the river ran red with the blood of his soldiers. Now the land lay bare. The Hun horde swept unchecked through the Balkans, burning, looting, destroying. There was so much blood that the dead could not even be counted. Even mighty Constantinople trembled. Its walls, tall and proud, were the only thing standing between Attila and the heart of the empire. Hastily, Isaurian troops rushed in to defend them, while terrified citizens prayed behind the gates. At last, Theodosius II bent once more to the inevitable. By the end of 447 CE, he sued for peace again. The exact terms of this new treaty are unclear, but the Romans bowed lower, offered more concessions, and paid more gold. The Balkans were left in ruins. From Nisus to Serdica, cities lay desolate, fields empty, homes abandoned. Thrace and Moesia were scarred, their people scattered, their strength broken. The Huns had not just taken gold, they had carved terror into the land itself. The Huns were already taking over Rome. The Danube frontier, which was once Rome's shield, now belonged to Attila. But still Attila did not stop. In the year 451 CE, the shadow of Attila stretched westward. For years, he had ravaged the Eastern Empire, but now, with fire in his eyes, he turned toward Gaul. Why? The reasons are unclear in history, but some say it began with a ring. Honoria, the sister of Western Emperor Valentinian III, sent Attila her betrothal ring in secret. She was desperate to escape an unwanted marriage and hoped the Hun king would come to her rescue. But Attila did more than that. He seized her plea as a weapon. He declared Honoria his bride and demanded half the Western Empire as her dowry. Others claimed he sought revenge on the Visigoths of Toulouse, accusing them of seizing lands that once belonged to Rome. Still others suspected Vandal intrigue behind his march, but whatever the cause, Attila used it as a banner for war. When news of his invasion spread, fear swept across Gaul. The Rhine was crossed, and the horde poured in like floodwaters. Cities crumbled in his path. Metz, Divodurum, was burned, bishoprics shattered, and terror ran ahead of the hoofbeats. By June, Attila's horsemen had reached Orleans, Aurelianum, expecting the gates to open. Jordanes, the chronicler, later claimed that Sangiban, king of the Alans whose people guarded the city, had promised betrayal. Yet when Attila arrived, Orleans stood firm. For 4 long days in driving rain, the Huns battered the walls. Their engines thundered, their arrows darkened the sky, but the defenders clung to hope. Then, on June 14th, salvation came. Aetius, the Roman master of soldiers, arrived with his coalition host, and Attila was forced to lift the siege. The gallant defense of Orleans, held by Alans and Gauls, became the turning point. But this was only the beginning. The 2 armies, one a storm of steppe horsemen, the other a patchwork of allies, marched to meet each other near Châlons on the wide Catalaunian Plains. Aetius had worked like a craftsman, gathering every shard of strength he could. The Visigoths, under their king Theodoric I, answered his call, though Attila had sworn they were his true target. Franks came from the north, Burgundians from the east, Celtic Britons from Armorica, Alans with their cavalry, Saxons, and even remnants of old Roman garrisons, the Riparii, and the mysterious Olebrones. Jordanus later listed them like an army of nations, and so they were. The Romans had not gathered such a strange and diverse host in generations. Their power was in their variety, a mingling of horse and foot, barbarian and Roman, all united for one purpose: to stop Attila. The Huns, though, were no less terrible. Attila, cunning as always, chose his battlefield carefully. On the wide, flat plains near Châlons, his horsemen could ride free, their arrows flying, their charges devastating. As the sun sank, the 2 great hosts clashed. Chroniclers say the battle was savage and chaotic, a storm of spears, swords, and screams. Dust rose into the sky, blotting out the day. At a crucial moment, Theodoric, the Visigothic king, led a bold counterattack against the Hun left, but fate was cruel. Amidst the fury, Theodoric fell, trampled under horses, or pierced by enemy weapons. No one could say. His death struck his people like a thunderbolt. and grief nearly broke them. Yet the battle did not end. Aetius, ever calculating, restrained his forces. Some later whispered that he deliberately held back part of his army, preventing a total annihilation of the Huns. He may have feared that if the Visigoths triumphed too greatly, they would become Rome's next enemy. Whatever his reason, the battle ended not in total destruction, but in exhaustion. By nightfall, Attila's horde faltered. The proud Hun king, who had never known defeat, ordered a retreat. His army slipped away into the dark, beaten in spirit if not in numbers, fleeing north of the Alps. For the Romans and their allies the cost was heavy. Theodoric lay dead, thousands of warriors with him. But Attila had been stopped. He never returned to Gaul. Prosper of Aquitaine, the Roman chronicler, proclaimed it a victory, and so it was. The Huns had not conquered Gaul. They had been turned back. Historians later called this battle one of the great turning points of the age. It marked the high tide of Attila's ambitions in the west. His dream of seizing Gaul had been shattered, his aura of invincibility dimmed. For Aetius, the result was enough. Theodoric was gone, Attila was retreating, and Rome could claim the honor of victory. It was not a clean triumph. Both sides bled. Both armies limped away. But Rome and her allies had saved Gaul, if only for a time, and though Attila's gaze now turned toward Italy, the plains of Châlons remained a scar on his pride, the field where the unstoppable Hun was finally forced to stop. In 452 CE, the storm came south. Attila, the Scourge of God, who had already broken the Balkans and thundered through Gaul, now set his sights on Italy. Why he came was a knot of reasons: opportunity, pride, desperation. Honoria's schemes had failed, Aetius was still strong, and yet the Western Empire looked weakened, ripe for spoils. And so in the spring, Attila led his horde across the Alps and descended into the rich Po Valley. The devastation began with Aquileia, the shining Roman border city at the head of the Adriatic. 4 days the Huns surrounded it, and then, like wolves tearing down a gate, they broke through. What followed was not conquest, but obliteration. Aquileia was so utterly destroyed, one chronicler later wrote, that its ruins could scarcely be recognized. Its survivors fled into the marshy lagoons, building huts on stilts among the reeds. In time, people would call this place Venice, but there was no pause. Like fire rushing through dry fields, Attila's fury spread across northern Italy. Padua, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, Milan, one by one, they fell. The Huns tore down walls, burned houses, slaughtered or enslaved whole populations. Gold, jewels, and works of art were carried off. Churches and temples were left in ashes. Even proud Milan, the second city of the Western Empire, was seized and plundered. Italy panicked. Families abandoned villages. Fields lay empty. The countryside turned into wasteland. Civil society cracked under terror. Emperor Valentinian III and his mother, Galla Placidia, could do little. Aetius, who had lost much of his strength at the Catalaunian Plains, could only trail the invaders, striking at their foragers, but never able to meet Attila in full battle. To the people, it seemed the Huns were unstoppable, and many whispered that Rome itself would soon fall. And then, legend. Near the river Mincio, close to Mantua, a delegation met Attila face to face. At its head was Pope Leo I, accompanied by 2 imperial envoys. What passed between them remains shrouded in mystery. Some say Leo spoke with such authority that even Attila, the feared warlord, listened. Prosper of Aquitaine, the Roman chronicler, insisted it was Leo who persuaded him to spare Rome. Others suggest Attila remembered the fate of Alaric, the Gothic king, who had sacked the city in 410 CE, only to die shortly after, and superstition gnawed at his heart. But there were other forces at work too. Famine gripped Italy that year. Disease spread through the land. Attila's men and horses were exhausted, his long trek draining their strength. He had already gathered mountains of gold and chains of slaves. Pushing further south into a starving land may have seemed more risk than reward. Diplomacy, fear, hunger, and plague all conspired together. Whatever the true reason, the end was the same. Attila lifted his siege and turned back. The horde withdrew beyond the Alps, leaving northern Italy in ruins but sparing Rome itself. It was the last great raid of the Hunnic Empire. Within 2 years, Attila would be dead, his vast dominions splintering like glass. But the terror he left behind would echo for generations, long after his horsemen vanished beyond the horizon. To the Romans, the Huns were not men at all. They were monsters. But why did they write this way? Because propaganda works better than confession. Rome could not admit its failures, so it invented a mask for its shame. They called them the inhuman Hun. It was easier to imagine demons on horseback than to face the truth of Roman weakness. And yet, when the curtain is pulled back, another story emerges. Priscus, a diplomat who walked into Attila's court in 449 CE, gave us a different testimony. His testimony is a lantern in the dark, showing a world far different from the Roman nightmare. He saw villages of reed huts, fields where millet was grown, fires where mead was brewed, and even beer flowing in cups. He tasted Hun hospitality. He sat at Attila's feasts, where harps played and noblewomen came adorned in fine dress. He saw wooden houses, stockades, and even a Roman-style bathhouse built for Hun nobility. Attila's own home was not a tent blown by the wind, but a polished wooden palace, sturdy, deliberate, and grand. This was not savagery, this was society. Politically, too, the Huns were no rabble. Their confederation was vast. Huns, Goths, Alans, and others all lashed together under Attila's rule. And what fueled this empire? Gold. Not their gold, but Rome's. Tribute payments flowed steadily north. In 434, Attila forced Constantinople to pay 700 pounds of gold each year. Soon, that sum was tripled. In the west, he demanded even more, cloaked as dowry, when Valentinian III's sister Honoria sought his help. These were not aimless raids. These were calculated negotiations, diplomacy sharpened with the blade of fear. So who were the Huns? Truly, they were not monsters. They were warriors, and also farmers, builders, musicians, and diplomats. They brewed mead and built palaces, ruled councils and struck bargains, terrified emperors and broke kingdoms. Their strength lay not only in their swords, but in their ability to weave war and diplomacy into one. Rome did not face mindless savages. It faced a rival that played the game of empire in its own way. The Huns did not end the world, but they were a storm that Rome could not control.